In the first half of the 30s, the entire fighter aviation of Great Britain still relied on biplanes. The undisputed leader among them was the Fury, created by the design bureau of the Hawker firm under the leadership of the legendary Sidney Cam. At that time, only the Fury was capable of outrunning the newest light bomber, the Hart, which, by the way, was designed by the same Sidney Cam. This small biplane with a V-shaped Kestrel engine was distinguished by its good climb rate, excellent maneuverability, and had a deservedly high reputation among pilots of the Royal Air Force. Not stopping at what had been achieved, Sidney Cam constantly improved the Fury, step by step, polishing the aerodynamics and improving the power plant. But let's be frank, these were only half measures. They did not give a significant increase in flight characteristics, while world aviation was already entering an era of a rapid technological leap. Feeling which way the wind was blowing, the experienced designer began to think about creating a completely new fighter that could worthily replace the good old Fury. But first of all, the question arose, what exactly should it be? The policy of the British Air Ministry regarding material parts in those years was determined by Specification F730. This document, in essence, reflected the complete chaos in the heads of ministry theorists, who themselves could not yet clearly determine the prospects for the development of fighters. The task was quite vague and contradictory, as it was based only on a minimal improvement in flight data while maintaining weak armament and the usual tactics of close maneuvering combat, the so-called dogfight. The maximum speed was planned at the level of just 250 miles per hour. Continuing the tradition of strict economy adopted after the First World War, they wanted to make the plane universal. It was supposed to be simultaneously an interceptor, a frontline fighter, and an escort for bombers. As a result, a large number of conflicting requirements made this task almost impossible. Of course, it cannot be said that the ministry was completely unaware of the changes in the world. But the general situation looked quite calm. Hitler was still far from the peaks of power, and all potential adversaries had approximately the same, if not worse, fighters. Therefore, Specification F730 existed for quite a long time, although adjustments were made to it from time to time. For example, later the maximum speed bar was raised to 275 miles per hour. That is why initially Sidney Cam proceeded only from the idea of a deep modernization of the existing platform. He decided to turn the Fury into a monoplane. It is worth noting that back in 1925, Cam had already created a small monoplane fighter, but then it had no success and did not go into series. Now the designer decided that the time for monoplanes had come. And in this he was not alone. All over the world, a new generation of high-speed fighters was being born, which in the West would later be called the New Wave. The new project received a simple working name, Fury Monoplane. As a basis, they took one of the experimental variants, the high-speed Fury. The fuselage was borrowed from it almost entirely, although the dimensions of the frames in the middle part had to be increased to make the cockpit closed. The fuselage itself had a classic design for Hawker, patented by Thomas Sopwith back in 1926. A load-bearing truss of tubes reinforced with bracing wires over which frames and stringers were put on, serving only as a framework for the fabric covering. The tail unit also passed to the monoplane by inheritance. They even kept the old landing gear, non-retractable struts with wheels and teardrop-shaped fairings. Only the wing of a rather thick profile was designed anew, and the heart of the machine was to be a new engine from the Rolls-Royce firm, the Goshawk model with evaporative cooling. In June 1933, a mock-up of the new aircraft was made on a scale of 1 to 10, which was immediately blown in a wind tunnel. By August, the results were processed and, together with the preliminary design, presented to the Air Ministry. However, they did not arouse much interest. Officials at that time still preferred proven biplanes. But Sidney Cam continued work at his own peril and risk, financing the project at the expense of the firm. He was not only the chief designer, but also a member of the board of directors. Fortunately, Hawker had money. Based on the successful Hart, a large family of light bombers and reconnaissance aircraft had grown, which formed the backbone of the Royal Air Force in the interwar years. Moreover, hedging his bets, Cam was developing two machines at once. In parallel with the monoplane, the biplane PV-3 was being prepared, essentially the same Fury, but with enhanced armament and the same Goshawk engine. In January 1934, an event occurred that radically influenced the fate of the new fighter. The Rolls-Royce company sent documentation for its newest engine, PV-12, which would later receive the legendary name Merlin. The designers enthusiastically accepted the opportunity to abandon the unreliable Goshawk. Compared to the Kestrel engine that stood on the Fury, the novelty promised to be 40 to 60% higher in power. True, the installation of the PV-12 required significant changes in the design. Due to the shift in the center of gravity by the heavier motor, the radiator had to be moved back under the center section, and there was nowhere to hide it in the body as previously planned. As a result, so little remained of the original Fury in the new machine that the project name was changed to Interceptor Monoplane. This is exactly how CAM saw the main role of a high-speed fighter. It seems that the Soviet designer Polikarpov was not alone in his theory about the necessity of two types of fighters. In February and March of 1934, two more important changes were made to the project. First, the Fury-type landing gear was decided to be replaced with a newfangled retractable one. Moving the radiator back freed up space in the front part of the center section where the wheel wells were placed. The struts folded by hydraulic drive to the axis of the aircraft, and the pilot had to pump the hydraulic pump manually. For better aerodynamics in the retracted state, the wheels were covered with shields. The second change concerned armament. Specification: F-730 required the presence of 4 machine guns of .303 caliber, approximately 7.7 millimeters. Initially, the bet was placed on the proven Vickers Mark V, but to the military, this system already seemed outdated. Having tested a dozen different aviation machine guns, they chose the American Browning and concluded an agreement with the manufacturer, the Colt Automatic Weapon Corporation, to adapt this weapon for the English cartridge. Considering this, CAM laid into the project 2 Brownings in the wings and 2 Vickers in the fuselage. A little later, a new technical task, FE-534, appeared, which required from 6 to 8 machine guns. CAM, fearing delays, ordered to proceed from the old variant with 4 barrels for now, but in parallel began to work out the placement of additional armament. Work really went fast. In May 1934, the designers set about detailed drawings of the prototype. In June, a reduced-scale model was tested in the wind tunnel in Teddington, and the blowdown showed that the aircraft was capable of exceeding a speed of 348 miles per hour. At the end of August, CAM's amateur activity was finally backed up by an official order F-3634, which actually described the already designed machine, a single-seat, high-speed monoplane fighter. The firm officially received it on September 4th. The task required a maximum speed of 320 miles per hour. In the autumn of 1934, they began manufacturing a full-size mock-up, which was finished in December. And already on November 17th, the experimental shop received the first drawings and began preparing the tooling. On January 10th, 1935, a mock-up commission gathered in the premises of the Hawker Design Bureau in Kingston. Representatives of the ministry and the Air Force headquarters calmly reacted to the fact that only 2 Vickers stood on the mock-up. Everyone knew perfectly well that the production of new machine guns in Birmingham had not even begun to be mastered yet. The mock-up was successfully approved. On February 21st, Hawker sent refined, calculated characteristics of the future fighter to the Air Ministry. It was expected that the maximum speed would exceed the requirements of the technical task and reach 330 miles per hour. At the same time, the estimated takeoff weight increased to 4,916 pounds. This was almost 300 pounds more than Sidney CAM had initially planned. The lion's share of this additional weight was the mass of the engine, which got heavier in the process of refinement, as well as the increased ammunition load, which had to be laid to maintain the correct centering. On the same day, the ministry went forward and officially ordered the construction of 1 prototype. In fact, they started assembling this machine earlier, but it took another 6 months to bring it to mind. In August 1935, the fighter was assembled, after which about another month and a half was spent on covering the fuselage, wings, and tail unit with fabric, as well as on a thorough check of all nodes. At this moment, the customers had strictly decided on the armament. In July, an instruction came to install 8 Browning machine guns. Since they did not yet exist in metal, the experimental machine was loaded with ballast simulating their weight. This, together with a small increase in the capacity of the fuel tanks, brought the real takeoff weight of the fighter to 5,423 pounds. Instead of cartridges and a radio station, they also put ballast. It is worth noting that the aircraft had a Merlin C engine, which at that time had not yet passed the resource tests mandatory for obtaining a state certificate. But the importance of the new fighter was so great that they simply closed their eyes to bureaucratic formalities. On October 23rd, the aircraft was transported to Brooklands, where it was reassembled after transportation. The machine was weighed, the motor was tested, and the company pilot Paul Bullman began the first runs on the airfield. And already on November 6th, he lifted the machine into the air for the first time. At the end of 1935, far-sighted people in the leadership of British aviation clearly realized the consequences of Hitler coming to power. The Royal Air Force began a program of expansion and modernization at an accelerated pace. They desperately needed new fighters. Many difficulties encountered during the refinement of the Hawker monoplane and its launch into series were connected precisely with this frantic haste. For example, the raw motor failed as early as February 1936. There were enough troubles with other units as well. All the first flights were performed by Bullman, an experienced pilot, a veteran of the First World War, who before coming to Hawker worked as a test pilot at the research center in Farnborough. Since 1925, absolutely all the firm's machines had passed through his hands. Over 3 months, the fighter underwent a number of changes. The engine was overheating, so to combat this, the radiator area was increased, accordingly making its fairing more massive as well. The stabilizer struts were deemed unnecessary and removed altogether. But the canopy frame, which vibrated in the wind, was significantly strengthened. A little later, the central section of the landing flaps, which disrupted the flow around the radiator, was removed, as were the lower sections of the landing gear doors. After all these improvements, the takeoff weight reached 5,680 pounds. At first, Bullman complained about the cramped cockpit and poor forward visibility during taxiing, but later he got used to it. The fighter did not quite reach the calculated speed, but showed a solid 315 miles per hour in tests. This was the first English fighter to overcome the previously unattainable mark of 300 miles per hour. Stability and controllability were normal. In February 1936, the experimental aircraft was transferred to the Experimental Center A and AEE in Martlesham Heath. Military test pilot David Anderson, who flew it, confirmed the data of the factory flights and quite highly appreciated the maneuverability of the machine, noting only an increase in the load on the controls at high speeds. In March, Hawker designers began preparing working drawings for mass production. And on June 3rd, the Air Ministry ordered 600 fighters from Hawker at once. A week later, drawings began to arrive in the workshops. This was the largest order the Royal Air Force had ever issued in peacetime. But Hawker Aircraft at that moment was already part of the huge Hawker Siddeley concern, which united 5 large firms and could digest even more than that. And indeed, later orders grew many times over. The ministry was building new plans for the expansion of the Air Force, and in all of them, equipping squadrons with the new Hawker fighter was laid down, which finally ceased to be a nameless interceptor monoplane and received its own formidable name, Hurricane. In July 1936, the aircraft was demonstrated to the public at the annual air show in Hendon. At that time, the fighter still remained unarmed, but this did not last long. Already at the beginning of August, a full set of 8 Browning machine guns was installed in the wing consoles. And on August 17th, the Hurricane took to the sky with full armament for the first time. By that time, the appearance of the future serial variant had been determined definitively. On July 20th, the firm received specification F-1536, which described the requirements for the serial machine. The main difference from the prototype was the replacement of the engine. Rolls-Royce engineers were not sitting idly by. Following the Merlin C model, version F appeared and later G. The latter turned out to be much more reliable and slightly more powerful. Type G went into series under the name Merlin II. It was decided to equip the first serial modification, Hurricane 1, with it. However, the change of heart entailed a reworking of the entire power plant. It was necessary to move the expansion tank, since Merlin was cooled not by water but by a mixture based on ethylene glycol, which had 1.5 times greater heat capacity, redesign the upper part of the cowling, and increase the carburetor intake pipe. Along the way, an improved starter was installed and engine control was made more convenient. All this slightly slowed down the launch into series. Initially, the first fighter was planned to be assembled in May or June of 1937, but changes in the drawings pushed the deadlines back by about 4 months. In September and October 1936, the Hurricane passed repeat tests in Martlesham Heath. In November, a factory check for spin, and from the beginning of 1937 returned again to the military test pilots for testing combat qualities. The machine behaved well were it not for one annoying flaw. The canopy was constantly torn off in flight. Just imagine, during the tests, this board lost the canopy 5 times. In July 1937, Soviet specialists looked at the Hurricane for the first time. A delegation arrived at the same exhibition in Hendon. Division Commander Bazanov, then head of the Air Force Research Institute, telegraphed in his report, "Hawker Hurricane, with Merlin, not shown in flight. The machine with a motor of 1,065 horsepower can give over 310 miles per hour." At that time, such figures sounded more than convincing. Meanwhile, the Hawker factory in Kingston assembled the first serial aircraft. For some time, they stood in the workshops without engines. The first Merlin II was brought only on April 19, 1937, and they immediately began to mount it. Refinement of the new power plant lasted about 5 months. In September, the fighter packed in crates was transported to Brooklands. On October 12th, factory test pilot Philip Lucas lifted this machine into the air, and 6 days later, the second board followed it. By the end of November, 7 fighters had already been flown. The process looked like this. The planes were completely manufactured in Kingston, then disassembled and reassembled in Brooklands, where the final adjustment took place. Each machine made a dozen flights, performing the standard program of acceptance tests of the Air Force. It is worth adding that, inspired by the success of the Hurricane, Sidney Cam planned to create, based on it, a whole unified family of aircraft for various purposes using common nodes: wing, tail unit, landing gear. 2 such machines reached the stage of prototypes: the light bomber Henley and the turret fighter Hotspur, the armament of which stood in a large turret with a hydraulic drive. However, they had no success. The Henley was produced in a small series as a target tug, and the Hotspur remained experimental, giving way to a competitor, the Defiant from the Bolton Paul firm. At Christmas 1937, the first 4 Hurricanes were received by the 111th Fighter Squadron based in Northolt. By February of the following year, it already had 16 machines. The mastering of the newest equipment was led by squadron leader John Gillen. The Hurricane differed sharply in its data from the old Gauntlet biplanes on which the pilots of the 111th had previously flown. This transition was not easy. Several accidents occurred, 2 planes were seriously damaged, and one of the pilots, unfortunately, died during an unsuccessful landing. Nevertheless, the mastering of the new equipment went quite successfully. Take at least squadron leader Gillen himself. On February 10, 1938, he made a flight from Northolt to Edinburgh and back. On the way back, catching a powerful tailwind, he managed to reach an average speed of a whopping 408 miles per hour. When the first 24 fighters came off the assembly line in March 1938, the firm made a number of changes to the design. The tail wheel was decided to be fixed. Now, after takeoff, it no longer hid in the fuselage. The spin characteristics of the machine were improved by adding a small ventral fin under the tail. In its recess, as if in a fairing, the wheel was now located, and the rudder was extended downward to close the ledge that had formed. The updated machines arrived in the 3rd Squadron in Kenley and the 56th in North Weald. By the middle of 1938, the factory in Kingston had produced about 80 Hurricane aircraft, and 50 of them were already serving in combat units. Continuing to improve the fighter, engineers tested on it new ejector exhaust stacks developed by Rolls-Royce specialists, and later a metal Hamilton variable pitch propeller. The new stacks gave a speed increase of approximately 2 miles per hour and immediately went into series. In June 1938, the first serial Hurricane with such equipment showed 316 miles per hour in tests. But the real revolution was the propeller. The Hamilton propeller, which was produced under license by the de Havilland Company, was 3-bladed, had hydraulic pitch control, and worked in 2 modes, takeoff and cruise. It was significantly heavier, by a whole 300 pounds, than the old wooden 2-bladed Watts fixed-pitch propeller with which the Hurricane was equipped earlier. But this weight was worth it. The climb rate improved radically. The new propellers began to be installed from January 1939, and the 213th Squadron was the first to receive them. In order to increase combat survivability, the firm began experimenting with armor protection. First, a protective bulkhead in front of the pilot's cockpit was designed, which was introduced into production at the beginning of 1939. Already on February 6th, a plane with armored glass mounted in the windscreen took to the air, and a full set, including an armored seatback, was installed for the first time in April. By September 1939, when war was in the air, all planes were already standardly equipped with such protection. In the spring and summer of 1939, many more novelties were tested on the Hurricane, some of which significantly influenced the future of the series. They tested de Havilland and Rittal automatic propellers, the latter with blades made of magnesium alloy, split flaps, and a new radio station instead of the obsolete model. On the firm's experimental planes, new hearts were mounted: Merlin 3 engines with a unified shaft for different propellers, Merlin 8, experimental, operating on 100-octane gasoline and cooled by water, and Merlin 12, also for 100-octane fuel but with the usual cooling system. Thinking about the possible operation of fighters in the hellish heat of Africa and the Middle East, and also considering the interest from Turkey and Iran, in February 1939, the firm undertook the design of a tropical variant. Hawker already had experience. The Hart family had long flown in the tropics. A dust filter for the carburetor air intake was ordered from the Vaux company. Its chief designer proposed installing a large multi-V filter under the nose of the fighter, covering it with a specially profiled lower section of the cowling. Test pilot Philip Lucas lifted the first such tropical Hurricane into the air on May 17, 1939, after which the machine was sent for testing to Khartoum in Sudan. And finally, about the wings. Back in 1935, Sidney Cam began designing an all-metal wing with stressed duralumin skin. It was conceived as a single one for the Hurricane, Henley, and Hotspur. The first set was tested on the Henley back in 1937, and on the Hurricane it was put much later, on April 28, 1939. By the summer of that year, they managed to assemble by hand no more than a dozen sets of such wings. But then, having prepared the tooling, they began to increase the pace. The first Hurricanes with reinforced metal wings began to arrive in the troops just in time, right by the beginning of the Second World War. At the end of May 1936, the Hurricane was demonstrated to the public at aviation festivals in 9 cities of the country. And already in July, planes of the 111th Squadron arrived on a friendly visit to Paris, where they took part in an air parade. In the same month, large-scale air defense exercises took place in the southeastern part of England. When the Munich crisis broke out and Germany made territorial claims to Czechoslovakia, the British Air Force was urgently brought to combat readiness. Pilots were on duty right next to fueled and armed fighters. The situation was so tense that the Germans even managed to photograph rows of brand new Hurricanes at the Biggin Hill Air Base from aboard a Lufthansa passenger liner. When Chamberlain appeased Hitler by giving him the Sudetenland and the specter of war seemed to have receded, English aviation returned to peacetime mode. In November 1938, a serial Hurricane taken straight from the assembly shop in Brooklands was exhibited at the prestigious air show in Paris. In May of the following year, 1939, members of the British Parliament in Northolt observed the flyover of 6 squadrons of new fighters at once. In July, Hawker test pilot Richard Raynell impressed the public at an international exhibition in Brussels with a cascade of aerobatic figures. And in August, the British Air Force began grandiose maneuvers involving more than 1,300 machines in the sky over England and France, simulating the repulsion of a landing on the coast. Hurricane production was constantly growing. From the end of 1938, production rates were even slightly ahead of the Air Ministry's plans. A new Hawker factory in Langley and a Gloucester firm enterprise in Brockworth were preparing to assemble planes. If in September 1938, 5 squadrons were equipped with new fighters, then in July 1939, already 12, and another 6 squadrons of auxiliary reserve forces began to rearm. As a result, by the beginning of the Second World War, there were 18 combat-ready squadrons on Hurricanes in service. On September 1, 1939, Wehrmacht units crossed the border of Poland. German aviation delivered massive strikes on airfields and communication nodes. 2 days later, England and France declared war on Germany. A baptism of fire awaited the hurricane. It is high time to describe in detail what the serial hurricane looked like at that time. Let's start with the fuselage. Its basis was a welded truss of steel tubes stretching along the entire length, from the rudder to the very nose of the machine, including the engine mount. The rigidity of the structure was increased by diagonal internal bracing wires. Behind the pilot's cockpit, shaped frames made of thick plywood were put on top of this truss. Longitudinal wooden slat stringers were laid in their recesses, and already on this dense mesh lay fabric impregnated with varnish covering the rear part of the fuselage. In the front part, the frame was duralumin. The cockpit sides had plywood skin glued outside with fabric, and the engine hid behind removable duralumin panels. The layout of the fuselage was quite traditional. The engine with units in front, behind the fire bulkhead, the gas tank, then another bulkhead, and actually the pilot's cockpit. The pilot's seat was adjustable in height. The cockpit was covered by a transparent canopy made of plexiglass. A plate of armored glass was installed on the stamped windscreen from the outside. Under the rear edge of the windscreen passed a steel bent tube, a vital element protecting the pilot in case of a nose-over, the plane flipping onto its back. A rear-view mirror was attached on top of the windscreen. To get inside, the pilot slid the movable part of the canopy back. This process was simplified by small doors on the right side. Immediately behind the armor plate covering the pilot's back were the radio station, battery, first aid kit, oxygen cylinders, and 2 tubes for dropping flares. Further to the very tail, the fuselage remained empty. The wing of the overwhelming majority of Hurricanes was all metal. Production of early wooden wings ceased in the spring of 1940. Structurally, it was divided into 3 parts. The center section, which was integrated with the fuselage and was an integral part of it, and 2 consoles. The power set consisted of 2 main steel spars of I section, and in the outer part of the consoles, 3 auxiliary ones were added to them. Ribs were stamped from duralumin. Duralumin stringers went over them, reinforcing the skin, which in all late series was also metal. Ailerons with a metal frame but covered with fabric were hinged on the trailing edge. But the flaps located under the wing between the ailerons were metal and were extended using a hydraulic drive. It was in the wing that everything most important was hidden: armament, wheel wells, main fuel tanks, and landing lights. The tail unit, both vertical and horizontal, had a duralumin frame covered with fabric. Rudders were equipped with horn compensation, internal balances, and trim tabs to facilitate control. The landing gear was classic, 3-point with a tail wheel. 2 main struts with Vickers, high-drop pneumatic shock absorbers, were attached to the front spar of the center section. Hydraulics folded them along the wing to the axis of the aircraft. In the retracted position, the strut and part of the wheel were covered by a special shield. An emergency system was also provided. If the automation failed, the landing gear could be extended with a foot pump located in the cockpit near the left pedal. Dunlop pneumatic brakes were on the main wheels. The tail wheel was self-orienting with a Dowty shock absorber and did not retract in flight. The heart of the Hurricane 1 was Rolls-Royce Merlin engines of 2 types, 2 and 3, which differed only in the design of the shaft nose. This was a powerful 12-cylinder V-shaped liquid-cooled motor. It was started by an electric starter, but in field conditions, mechanics could start the Merlin manually using 2 removable handles. Motors of Type 2 were fitted with 2-bladed wooden Watts Z38 fixed-pitch propellers, with a diameter of about 11 feet 3 inches. Later they were replaced by more advanced 3-bladed metal de Havilland propellers, models DH531 or 32 with 2 propeller pitches. And on Merlin 3, it was already possible to put both de Havilland propellers and 3-bladed Rotol RMS-7 with wooden blades. The shape of the propeller spinner depended on exactly which propeller stood on the aircraft. The cooling system worked not on water, but on a glycol mixture based on ethylene glycol. The tank with the mixture was placed above the motor, near the fire bulkhead. Both glycol and oil were cooled in a common tunnel radiator suspended under the center section. The airflow through it was regulated by the pilot using flaps. The engine was fed by gasoline with an octane rating of 87. Fuel was poured into 3 self-sealing tanks, 2 wing tanks of 40 gallons each, and 1 fuselage tank of 33 gallons. The oil tank held 12.5 gallons. The aircraft had a developed system of communications. The pneumatic system was responsible for reloading and firing machine guns as well as the operation of brakes. Air was pumped by a compressor driven by the engine. Hydraulics controlled the flaps and landing gear retraction. Pressure in it was maintained by a pump on the left side of the motor. The 12-volt electrical system was powered by a generator, and when the engine was silent, by a battery behind the pilot's seat. Electricity lit the cockpit, powered instruments, navigation lights, and landing lights, which, by the way, could be turned slightly down right from the cockpit. An interesting detail concerned communication. The shortwave radio station TR-9D, which stood behind the armored bulkhead, was powered not from the general network but from its own dry battery. It worked through a wire antenna stretched between the mast on the fuselage and the fin. Separately, it is worth dwelling on the teeth of this beast. The armament consisted of 8 Browning machine guns of .303 caliber, the famous .303 British. The rate of fire was frantic, 1,200 rounds per minute. Machine guns were located in batteries of 4 in each wing console, right behind the landing gear struts, feeding, belt. Boxes with belts were placed to the left and right of the barrels themselves. Most of them held 338 rounds and only the furthest from the fuselage, 324. An interesting nuance, the British loaded each belt with cartridges of one type. The standard scheme looked like this: 3 machine guns fired ordinary bullets, 3 incendiary of 2 different samples, and 2 armor-piercing. Initially, the weapons were sighted so that the lines of fire converged at a point at a distance of 380 to 440 yards from the nose of the aircraft. Later, with combat experience, this distance was shortened to dagger-like, 220 to 270 yards. Reloading and firing were pneumatic, the trigger on the control stick. On early machines stood a primitive ring sight with a front sight, which was later replaced by a more advanced optical GM2. Shooting results were recorded by a gun camera G42 or G42B, mounted in the root part of the right wing. Subsequently, of course, the armament of the Hurricane was significantly strengthened and diversified, but more on that later. By the beginning of the war, out of 600 ordered fighters, the Hawker firm managed to hand over 497. At that moment, 18 squadrons were fully combat ready, and another 3 were just mastering the new equipment. Together with units of the British Expeditionary Force, 4 squadrons on Hurricanes were sent to France: the 85th, 87th, 1st, and 79th. The very first, on September 8th, the 1st Squadron flew to Le Havre. Pilots were scattered across various airfields in northern France. Why was the Hurricane chosen for this mission and not the elegant Spitfire? 2 factors played a role here. Firstly, the command saved the Spitfires for the defense of England itself. And secondly, the landing gear of Cam's fighter was much more reliable and better adapted to the rough field airfields of the continent. English planes began regular patrolling of the frontline zone. This was the period of the so-called phony war, when the activity of both sides remained low. Aviation mainly conducted reconnaissance and scattered leaflets, trying to avoid direct clashes. The first victory on a Hurricane was achieved only on October 30th, almost a month after the start of hostilities. Pilot Peter Mold from the 1st Squadron intercepted a trio of German Dornier 17 bombers in the clouds over the Vassencourt airfield. The attack came as a complete surprise to the Germans. They didn't even try to escape and didn't open return fire. Only on November 2nd, pilots of the 73rd Squadron downed another Dornier. In search of the enemy, the British sometimes flew into German territory as well. On November 23rd, Lieutenant Plinston shot down a Heinkel 111 near Saarbrücken. But in general, the enemies acted sluggishly. By the end of the year, there were only about 20 downed machines on the account of British fighters. Serious problems with the operation of the Hurricane did not arise except that machine guns often failed. The investigation showed a comical, were it not for the war, reason. Quartermasters shipped cartridges to the front that had lain in warehouses for 30 years or more. The planes of the first series themselves were gradually replaced with newer ones or modernized. New propellers, stacks, etc. were installed. By the new year of 1940, almost no machines with old Watts propellers remained in the units. The war became a catalyst for both mass production and the evolution of the fighter. On October 6, 1939, Hawker handed over the last aircraft from the first order for 600 units. But back in November 1938, the Air Ministry ordered an additional 900 machines, 300 from Hawker and 600 from Gloucester. The Gloucester Aircraft Factory in Brockworth produced its first Hurricane in October 1939. On the 20th, it took to the sky. The pace grew frantically. If in the last quarter of 1939, an average of 64 planes were assembled per month, then in March 1940, already 236, this level was maintained until the middle of 1943. A considerable contribution to this was made by the new Hawker Enterprise in Langley, from the workshops of which the first Hurricane rolled out on October 27, 1939. In Kingston, starting from the 81st aircraft of the second order, they switched to metal wings. For some time, the factories produced both types in parallel, but from March 1940, all three enterprises put exclusively metal on fighters. By the way, such wings were made with a reserve, so during major repairs, they replaced old fabric ones on machines of early series. From the beginning of 1940, another important modernization followed. De Havilland or Rotol automatic propellers began to be installed on fighters. This significantly improved the climb rate, a parameter critical for an interceptor. Several minor changes were also made. The radio antenna mast began to taper upwards, a second antenna beam appeared, going from the strut down. And of course now every board came off the assembly line already with standard armor protection. The Royal Air Force did not waste the time of the so-called phony war, significantly building up muscles both quantitatively and qualitatively. But the real test of strength began in May of 40. On May 10th, German troops crossed the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, rapidly marching around the Maginot Line. The pace of the offensive was ensured by the Luftwaffe, who quickly seized air supremacy. English aviation in France at that moment was divided into two groups, the aviation of the Expeditionary Force and the Advanced Air Striking Force. The first included 4 squadrons on Hurricanes, the 85th, 87th, 607th, and 615th. The latter, however, was still half flying on old Gladiators. Later they were reinforced by 3 more units. The advanced forces, in addition to the existing 2 squadrons, the 1st and 73rd, received the 501st. The guys from the 501st entered the battle literally an hour after arrival, repelling a raid of 4 dozen Heinkel 111s. The result of the first day, May 11th, was impressive. Pilots destroyed 2 Heinkels, 2 Messerschmitt 110s, and 2 Dorniers without their own losses. But the next day, the meat grinder became tougher. The squadron recorded 7 Heinkel 111s, 3 Dornier 17s, 1 Messerschmitt 110, and 1 Junkers 88 on its account, but lost 2 pilots itself. Initially, English fighters covered the attempt of the Expeditionary Force to advance into Belgium, and then the bitter retreat to the coast of the English Channel. The intensity of flights was frantic. They had to face armadas of 50 to 60 enemy machines. Basically, Hurricanes were used to patrol the front line and intercept, but sometimes they were involved in escorting light battle and Blenheim bombers. Losses were huge, and replenishment from England did not arrive in full volume. The Air Force Command decided that sending such a number of pilots and planes across the English Channel, and towards the end of the campaign 13 squadrons of just Hurricanes fought there, was simply dangerous for the defense of the islands themselves. In the first week of fighting, Hurricanes from the aviation of the Expeditionary Force destroyed 60 to 70 enemy aircraft in the sky of France, losing 22 of their own. But even more machines were lost on the ground. German aviation bombed airfields, damaged equipment had to be burned or simply abandoned during retreat. Units lost combat capability, they were recalled or merged together. On May 17th, only 3 squadrons could fight. On May 21st, the remnants of the aviation of the Expeditionary Force were ordered to fly to southern England and cover the troops from there. It was for this that units from the depths of the country were concentrated near the coast. Spitfires finally joined the Hurricanes. Together they ensured the evacuation of English troops from Dunkirk. Battles went with varying success, although sometimes outstanding victories fell to the lot of the English. Sergeant Butterfield, in just one day, May 27th, grounded 4, a Junkers 88, a Messerschmitt 110, and 2 Messerschmitt 109s. The evacuation lasted 9 days, and all this time the fighters made 5 to 6 sorties a day. The advanced air striking force fought in France for almost another month. They were based on airfields southeast of Paris, dispersing over small sites near the front line. They covered the troops and retreated west with them. By June 15th, almost all Hurricanes were out of order. Reinforcements transferred from England, the 17th and 242nd Squadrons, defended Nantes, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire from where the evacuation was conducted. When on June 17th the order came for the pilots to return home, they had almost no planes left. Due to a lack of spare parts and fuel, the Germans simply finished off the remnants of the proud birds on the airfields. In total, the British lost 261 Hurricanes in France. Moreover, approximately 2/3 of them were machines damaged and abandoned or burned by the British themselves during the chaotic retreat. In operations to cover the evacuation from Dunkirk, losses amounted to another 219 fighters of various types. In total, this approached half of the entire existing fleet of fighter aviation of the kingdom. But iron is iron. Losses of equipment could be restored. English factories at that time accelerated to a pace of 400 fighters per month. Much more terrible was the loss of over 200 pilots. Career pilots of pre-war training, the elite of the Air Force. To these gloomy figures, one should add the losses incurred in Norway. In May 1940, a squadron on Hurricanes was transferred to the Allied-held north of the country. They were delivered by the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, from whose deck the fighters took off. Although they were not adapted for this, together with the Gladiator biplanes that arrived earlier, they defended the port of Narvik. On May 28th, 2 days after arriving at the Bardufoss airfield, the squadron opened its combat account by shooting down a Junkers 88. On the same day, pilots shot up 2 Do-26 flying boats on the water, which were landing troops. But Norway could not be held. On June 7th, the order came. Burn the planes, load personnel onto ships. The pilots decided otherwise. Contrary to the order, they took a crazy risk. Not having arresting hooks and experience in deck landings, they all safely landed on HMS Glorious. Unfortunately, this bravery turned out to be in vain. On the way home, the aircraft carrier ran into German battleships and was sunk. Together with it, all the saved planes and almost all the pilots of the squadron went to the bottom. Only 2 survived, Squadron Leader Cross and Lieutenant Jameson, who were picked up by a merchant ship. Why did British aviation suffer such heavy losses in the first operations of the war? There are many reasons, but one of them is the technical shortcomings of the Hurricane itself, the most massive English fighter at that time. In the sky of France and Norway, it encountered the German Messerschmitt Bf 109E, and it turned out that the Briton was inferior to its opponent in many ways. The British knew this for sure. Just before the German offensive, a real gift fell into their hands. On May 2nd, a Messerschmitt 109E landed in Amiens due to a minor malfunction, where the 1st Squadron of the Royal Air Force was based. Within 2 days, the trophy was ferried to the Boscombe Down Test Center and thoroughly tested. The verdict was disappointing. The German turned out to be faster in almost the entire altitude range. Only at an altitude of about 15,000 feet were the forces almost equal. The Messerschmitt 109E easily escaped in a dive. Its engine with direct fuel injection worked like a clock, unlike the Merlin with a float carburetor, which choked and gave failures at negative G-forces. The cannon armament of the Messerschmitts allowed opening fire from distances unattainable for machine guns. The weak armor of the Hurricane did not hold even hits from German bullets of 7.92 millimeters, let alone 20 millimeter shells. The only thing the English fighter could boast of was a small turn radius, thanks to lower wing loading, which gave it a chance in a dogfight on horizontals. But taking the Hurricane out of production and replacing it, say, with the more advanced Spitfire in the conditions of the summer of 1940 was out of the question. Breaking an established assembly line in conditions of a catastrophic shortage of aircraft would have been madness. On the contrary, Lord Beaverbrook, head of the newly created Ministry of Aircraft Production, included this machine in the top 5 priority types on which special emphasis was placed. 2 paths remained: modernize the machine and change the tactics of its use. The British took both, but they had very little time left. The Germans were already starting a massive air offensive on the British Isles, which history will remember as the Battle of Britain. After the end of the campaign in France, the command of the Royal Air Force made titanic efforts to restore the combat capability of fighter aviation. They replenished old squadrons, hastily formed new ones. For this, they had to scrape out everything: machines from conservation, from repair workshops, even from auxiliary units. This process, of course, disrupted modernization plans. Back in May 1940, it was planned to completely remove early Hurricanes with two-bladed propellers and fabric wing covering from combat units. But the reality of war made its adjustments. It was this antique that had to be taken out of warehouses to replace planes lost on the continent. However, thanks to the coordinated work of the factories, the situation was managed to be corrected quite quickly. Already by August 16th, only 20 machines with old wings and 15 with Watts propellers remained in service. The Hurricane remained the unconditional backbone of British defense. At the beginning of July, Fighter Command had 28 squadrons on these planes. In second place was the Spitfire, 17 squadrons. But here it is worth looking at the details. All units on Hurricanes were fully combat ready, while among Spitfires, 2 squadrons were engaged in tests, and another 4 were just mastering the new equipment. Pilot statistics are eloquent. Among those who flew CAMS fighters, 72% already had real combat experience, while on the Spitfire there were only 26% such pilots. In addition, only 8 airfields could fully service the capricious machines of the supermarine firm. But the Hurricane, undemanding neither to the quality of runways nor to workshop equipment, could be based practically anywhere. Since the beginning of June 1940, Luftwaffe planes began to nightmare British ships in the English Channel, and later, to visit the sky over the ports of southern England. The Germans acted in large flocks, 40 to 50 bombers under the cover of the same number of fighters. Until the English Air Force established a clear interception system, it often happened that only half a dozen patrol fighters went out against this armada, who, moreover, were running out of fuel. The Germans managed to send merchant ships with a total tonnage of 40,000 tons to the bottom, but they could not cut the supply arteries. English fighters shot down 186 enemy planes, losing 46 Hurricanes and 32 Spitfires. 28 pilots were saved. But this was only a prelude. The Luftwaffe command, on the Führer's orders, was preparing Operation Adlerangriff, Attack of the Eagles, a massive airstrike on Great Britain. This was the preparation of the ground for a sea landing. The main goal was to knock out the Royal Air Force, destroy airfields, command posts, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Officially, Adlerangriff started in the second half of the day on August 13th, 1940, with a delay of 3 days due to weather. It is from this date that the Germans count the beginning of the Battle of Britain. However, British historians begin the count earlier, from August 8th, when major battles over convoys near the Isle of Wight took place. At this moment, Fighter Command had 720 aircraft at its disposal. The ratio of Hurricanes, Spitfires, and other types looked like 5 to 3 to 1. They were opposed by 3 air fleets of the Reich, the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, with a total number of 2,700 machines, of which 970 were fighters. If counting the beginning of the battle in the English way, then the first shots were fired precisely by Hurricanes. On August 8th, a group of Junkers, 87 dive bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s and Messerschmitt 110s, appeared near the Isle of Wight, targeting a coastal convoy. German planes were detected by one of the coastal radars. A squadron of Hurricanes from West Hampnet took off to intercept them. A fight ensued over the convoy. Later, Spitfires pulled up. The Germans also threw reserves into the battle. As a result, planes of 5 squadrons were spinning in a dogfight from the English side alone. On the same day, the Luftwaffe delivered powerful strikes on the port in Dover and another convoy in the Thames estuary. It is not surprising that the British consider the 8th to be the beginning of the battle. Moreover, from this moment on, all major raids were accompanied by attempts to blind the air defense, destroy radars and runways. On August 12th, key radars on the south coast and large airfields in the county of Kent came under attack. 1 station was destroyed completely, 4 were damaged, and 3 airfields could continue work only at half strength. Considering the previous successes sufficient, Göring gave the go-ahead for the start of Operation Adlerangriff. The planning was clear. During the day, airfields became targets. At night, factories. However, the first day, August 13th, did not bring the Germans the expected triumph. The objects chosen for the first strike were located deep in the country, so interceptors raised in a timely manner thoroughly shredded the enemy. The score of losses: 47 German machines against 13 English. Part of the targets in the clouds were simply not found, and from other airfields the planes managed to take off before the bombs fell. Among industrial facilities, only the factory in Castle Bromwich, where Spitfires were assembled, suffered. On the 15th, Göring managed to organize a coordinated strike by the forces of all three air fleets. Around 11 in the morning, forward airfields came under attack, and later large formations of bombers moved to the main targets. They were met by English fighters. A real meat grinder began, which lasted until mid-September. Up to 200 planes could converge in the sky simultaneously. Taking into account previous experience, the Royal Air Force tried to use Hurricanes and Spitfires in tandem. The first broke through to the bombers, the second tied up the escort fighters in battle. The initiator of this tactic was Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of the 11th Group covering southeastern England. True, it quickly became clear that the firepower of the Hurricane was not enough for the confident destruction of German bombers. Heinkel 111, Dornier 17, and the newest Junkers 88, durable machines with decent armor. With the Junkers 87B dive bomber, the English fighter coped easily, just like with the twin-engine Messerschmitt 110C, if it managed to impose a maneuvering battle on turns and not climb under the salvo of No's 20mm cannons. But the Messerschmitt 109E was a deadly dangerous opponent. A few days after the start of the battle, the Germans changed tactics. They began to send groups of Messerschmitts on free hunts to clear the sky before a raid. They tried to catch the British on takeoff, landing, or simply on parking lots. German bombers were also modernized, hastily adding machine guns and armor. Both sides suffered colossal losses. Fighter Command lost on average one full squadron of Hurricanes a day. Raids went wave after wave, exhausting people to the limit. Pilots ate and slept right under the wings of their planes, while mechanics poured fuel and loaded ammunition belts. 10 minutes were given for takeoff on alarm, but in practice, the guys managed in 5. Factories did not have time to compensate for losses because Hurricanes perished not only in the air but also on the ground. On August 16th, a group of Junkers 88s covered the hangars of the air repair base in Bryce Norton with bombs. 28 fighters burned instantly. Parking lots of aircraft factories also got it. The situation was saved by the fact that the battles were fought over native land. Special teams promptly searched for and took out downed machines. The durable Hurricane, thanks to its simple design, was repaired quite easily, and some Frankensteins managed to return to service. It was worse with people. Cadets together with instructors were scraped out of flight schools. Test pilots from factories and research centers stood on combat duty. The fiercest battles took place from August 26th to September 6th. During these 12 days of hell, the British lost 134 Hurricanes. This is approximately 7 full-strength squadrons. 35 pilots died, 60 ended up in hospitals. Churchill slept without undressing in the staff bunker of Fighter Command, where plotters displayed the situation over the country on a huge screen. English cities were burning, thousands of civilians were dying under the ruins. When pilots rose into the air, they had no time to think about the technical shortcomings of the Hurricane. The enemy was nearby, he came to burn and kill, and the only answer to him was machine gun bursts. Defending their homeland, British pilots showed true heroism. An illustrative story is that of Lieutenant James Nicholson. Twice wounded with severe burns, he did not leave his burning machine until he got even with a Messerschmitt 110 that unexpectedly attacked him. Only when the German fighter went down in flames did Nicholson open his parachute. On the ground, he was, in truth, almost shot by his own Home Guard militias who were hunting for downed Germans, but everything worked out. Having recovered, he received the country's highest military award, the Victoria Cross. The only pilot of Fighter Command awarded this honor for the entire battle. He would die later. The Germans suffered even greater losses than the British. It was a race of attrition, who would run out of steam first. From September 7th, the intensity of raids began to subside. The last desperate splash was the attacks on London in the period of September 7th to 15th. There were fewer and fewer German planes in the sky, and Fighter Command began to raise whole squadrons and wings, regiments, to intercept. September 15th became the culmination. In just this one day, the Germans lost 56 machines, while the British 15 Hurricanes and 11 Spitfires. Realizing the futility of further daytime attacks, on September 17th, Hitler postponed the landing operation indefinitely. The German air offensive failed. The Luftwaffe was forced to switch mainly to night bombing tactics. British aviation not only gained invaluable experience but also grew both qualitatively and quantitatively. By the end of September, there are already 35 squadrons on Hurricanes in service. The Battle of Britain became a real gladiatorial combat of the 20th century. 2,648 planes of both sides were destroyed in it, and it was the old Hurricane that bore the main burden on its shoulders. On its account are 57% of all downed German machines, including 272 Messerschmitt 109 fighters. 7 of the 17 best aces of the battle flew specifically on the Hurricane. Names of such pilots as the legless squadron commander Douglas Bader or the South African sailor Mallon, who finished the war with 38 victories, have forever entered history. One can safely state this was the finest hour of CAM's aircraft. It is worth mentioning that Hurricanes were built not only in Great Britain. Licenses for production were purchased by Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Canada. The first licensee was the Yugoslav government under the agreement of 1938. Under the contract, Hawker delivered 12 ready-made Hurricane 1s and allowed their production at the Rogojarski and Zmaj factories in Belgrade. The first plane arrived in December of '38. It was a typical early fighter with a wooden propeller and fabric wing. Exactly such ones the Yugoslavs were going to build. Mastering production dragged on, so they had to buy another 12 machines in England. These were already more serious devices with Merlin 4 motors, variable pitch propellers, and metal wing skin. At the time of the German attack on Yugoslavia, April 1941, local factories managed to produce only 20 planes out of 60 ordered, all at the Zmaj factory. Rogojarski did not hand over a single one. So on April 6th, the Yugoslav Air Force had 38 Hurricanes in the 51st, 33rd, and 34th squadrons. They fought bravely in Bosnia and the Zagreb area, working both as fighters and ground attack aircraft. But the forces were unequal. On April 13th, when the Germans approached the airfields, the pilots themselves burned the last machines. One board still went to the Italians as a trophy. An interesting fact, in Yugoslavia, one Hurricane was experimentally converted for the German engine DB601A. According to pilots' reviews, this machine surpassed the standard ones, but its further fate was lost in the whirlpool of war. Belgium followed a similar path, purchasing 20 planes and a license for the Avians Ferry firm in April 1939. By September, only 15 boards managed to arrive. The rest were requisitioned by the British themselves due to the start of the war. The received fighters were transferred to the 2nd Squadron, Le Régiment d'Aéronautique. In the winter of 39 to 40, they even gained combat experience, intercepting German planes over the then still neutral Belgium. But on the very first day of the German offensive, most Belgian Hurricanes were destroyed right on the ground or shot up in the air. The local Avians Ferry factory managed to hand over about a dozen machines with Merlin 3 motors and 8 machine guns. They even started production of an advanced version with 4 large-caliber 50-caliber machine guns in the wings. They assembled 3 such planes, one even without a motor, but they didn't manage to fight. A completely different situation developed in Canada, where truly mass production was established. Back in 1938, the Canadian Air Force ordered 20 Hurricane 1s. They arrived in Canada in 1939. These were early versions, rag wing, wooden propeller. Irony of fate. In June 1940, these same planes returned back to England together with the 1st Squadron of the Canadian Air Force, which arrived to save the metropolis. Subsequently, Canadian pilots on Hurricanes successfully fought in Europe and the Middle East until the autumn of 1942. Even before the start of the Second World War, the British government, foreseeing possible difficulties, began to prepare reliable rear areas in overseas dominions. Under an agreement with the Canadian authorities in February 1939, a strategic order was placed for the production of Hurricane fighters at the Canadian Car and Foundry firm in Montreal. Already on March 2nd, a benchmark aircraft was delivered to the firm for study. And the first Canadian Hurricane 1 took to the sky over Montreal on January 10, 1940. Soon, rhythmic deliveries to England began. It is worth noting that Canadian machines immediately came in good configuration. They had Merlin 3 engines, metal wing skin, and 3-bladed de Havilland propellers. After the release of 166 such planes, the Montreal factory switched to the production of the Mark 10 modification, which already differed from the original English sample. The main feature was the heart of the machine, the Merlin 28 engine, manufactured under license in the USA by the Packard firm, paired with a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller. Armament remained classic, 8 machine guns. Almost all 10s were sent to England to help the metropolis. Only 25 units remained in Canada itself. On one of these planes, local engineers experimentally installed non-retractable ski landing gear, however, in the series. This specific solution did not take root. Later, the Mark 11 modification appeared. Its main difference was that the plane was equipped with Canadian, not English standard equipment. These machines were no longer exported. They were supplied exclusively for the needs of the Canadian Air Force. I hope it was interesting for you to learn more about this outstanding aircraft, which bore the main burden of the Battle of Britain. See you.